There is a silence that lives in certain buildings, a quiet that is not born of peace but of its absolute absence. It is the sound of concrete that has absorbed screams, of steel doors that have slammed shut on hope, and of wooden floors that have been scrubbed clean of everything but memory. In places like number 8 Prinz Albrechtstrasse in Berlin, the former headquarters of the Geheime Staatspolizei, the silence is an artifact. It is the residue of a terror so methodical, so bureaucratic, that it feels less like the work of monsters and more like the chillingly logical output of a machine designed for the sole purpose of grinding human beings into dust. We think we know the story of Nazi Germany. We see the black and white images of marching soldiers and feverish rallies. But this is the public face of the horror. The truer story, the more intimate and therefore more terrifying reality, unfolded not in grand stadiums, but in the suffocating confines of interrogation cells, on the unsterile operating tables of camp infirmaries, and along the frozen, corpse-lined roads of a collapsing empire. This is the story of the system's interior, of the mechanisms that turn suspicion into a death sentence, a human body into a medical specimen, and a continent into a graveyard. How does a modern, educated, and civilized nation orchestrate such a descent into barbarism? It does so not with a single act of evil, but with a million small, administrative steps, each one pushing the boundary of the unthinkable just a little further, until the unthinkable becomes routine. The journey into this abyss did not begin with the camps or the gas chambers. It began with an idea, an infection of the mind that presented itself as a cure. In the wake of Germany's humiliation in the Great War and the economic devastation that followed, the National Socialist Party offered a simple, potent, and poisonous narrative. The nation was sick, its blood tainted by enemies both external and internal, and it required a radical, painful surgery to restore its imagined purity and strength. To perform this surgery, the state would need a scalpel, an instrument of terrifying precision and power, capable of excising any element deemed diseased or undesirable. This instrument was forged on April 26, 1933, when Hermann Göring issued a decree establishing a new Prussian secret state police. Its name, the Geheime Staatspolizei, would be abbreviated into a single, guttural syllable that would become synonymous with fear itself, Gestapo. Initially, its focus was on political opponents, communists, socialists, and trade unionists. But under the meticulous, chillingly bureaucratic leadership of Heinrich Himmler and his protege, Reinhard Heydrich, its mandate expanded. It became the primary enforcer of Nazi racial ideology, the hunter of Jews, Roma, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, and anyone who dared to think, speak, or live in a way that contradicted the rigid dogmas of the Reich. The power of the Gestapo was not rooted in its numbers. At its peak, it had only around 32,000 official members to police a nation of over 60 million. Its true power lay in the atmosphere it cultivated. It built a vast network of informers, the Velut, who were woven into the fabric of daily life. The friendly neighbor, the disgruntled colleague, the local postman, any of them could be an ear for the state. This system turned society inward upon itself, transforming citizens into unpaid agents of their own oppression. The fear of the anonymous denunciation, the casual remark overheard and reported, was enough to enforce compliance. It created a world where private thought was the only remaining sanctuary, and even that felt precarious. The law itself was twisted into a weapon. A concept known as Schutzhaft, or protective custody, allowed the Gestapo to imprison individuals indefinitely without charge or trial, purely on the suspicion that they might one day commit a crime. It was a legal black hole from which there was often no escape, a complete suspension of civil rights that placed any individual entirely at the mercy of the state and its shadowy police force. The turning point for countless thousands was an event of brutal simplicity, a knock on the door, often in the gray, pre-dawn hours when resolve is at its lowest. It was the moment the abstract fear became a concrete reality. Men in long leather coats or plain clothes would enter, their politeness a thin veneer over a chilling authority. There was no discussion, no appeal to reason. There was only the quiet finality of the words. You will come with us. Wallets were checked, keys were confiscated, and a life was irrevocably cleaved in two. The time before the knock, and the endless, terrifying expanse of what came after. The journey would often lead to a local Gestapo office, but for those deemed particularly important or defiant, it ended at the dreaded epicenters of the system, like Prinz Albrechtstrasse in Berlin or the Hotel Metropole in Vienna. Here, the process of dehumanization began in earnest. The prisoner was stripped of their name and assigned a number. They were photographed, fingerprinted, and documented with the dispassionate efficiency of an entomologist classifying a new insect. The goal was to systematically dismantle a person's identity, to make them feel like a piece of administrative data, a file to be processed, long before the physical torture even began. The interrogation cell was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. It was often small, bare, and airless. There might be a wooden plank for a bed, a bucket for waste, and a single, bare bulb that was never ever turned off. The denial of darkness, the inability to distinguish day from night, was a deliberate technique designed to shatter the prisoner's internal rhythms and sense of time. Hours would bleed into days in a monotonous, disorienting haze, punctuated only by the sound of footsteps in the corridor, the distant clang of a door, or the muffled screams of another victim. This waiting was a form of torture in itself, a period of forced introspection where the mind, starved of external stimuli, would turn on itself, endlessly replaying the moment of arrest, searching for a mistake, a reason, a way out that did not exist. The interrogators understood this. They would let the silence and the isolation do their work for days, softening the prisoner's will before the formal sessions even started. When the interrogations began, they were rarely the crude beatings one might imagine, at least not at first. The Gestapo prided itself on its methods, which they chillingly referred to as verschärft Vernehmung, or intensified interrogation. The initial approach was often psychological. The interrogator might appear calm, even reasonable, offering a cigarette, a cup of ersatz coffee, and the illusion of a way out. "We know everything already," they would say, spreading a file of papers, often completely blank, on the table. "Your friends have talked. We just need your confirmation. Sign this confession, and this can all be over." It was a carefully constructed play, designed to sow paranoia and convince the prisoner that they were utterly alone, that their cause was lost, and that their comrades had betrayed them. They would dangle the fate of family members, threatening to arrest a spouse or send children to a state re-education facility. For many, this was the breaking point, the moment where the instinct to protect loved ones overrode any commitment to a cause or a secret. When psychological manipulation failed, the physical torment would begin, and it was applied with scientific coldness. The methods were varied and horrific. There was the stay bunker, a standing cell so narrow that the occupant could not sit, lie, or even turn around, forced to remain on their feet for days on end until their legs swelled to grotesque proportions and their minds began to fray. There were beatings, not frenzied and random, but methodical and targeted, using rubber truncheons or leather whips on the soles of the feet, the kidneys, and the joints to inflict maximum pain while minimizing the risk of a premature death that would halt the flow of information. Submersion in ice-cold water until the very brink of drowning, followed by revival and reinterrogation, was a common practice. So too were various forms of suspension, hanging prisoners by their wrists from the ceiling with their arms tied behind their backs, a technique that would slowly dislocate the shoulders and induce excruciating agony. The true genius of Gestapo torture, however, lay in its ability to leave few visible marks. The torturers were doctors of pain, not butchers. They used electrical torture, applying electrodes to the most sensitive parts of the body, fingers, toes, genitals, to deliver jolts of searing, debilitating pain that left no trace. They perfected the art of sleep deprivation, forcing prisoners to stand or march in circles for days, prodded with bayonets if they faltered, until hallucinations and psychosis set in. The goal was not just to extract a confession, whether true or false, but to completely annihilate the prisoner's personality. They sought to break not just the body, but the spirit, to reduce a human being to a terrified, compliant animal who would sign any document, name any associate, and do anything to make the pain stop. The ultimate success for an interrogator was not a signature on a piece of paper, but the sight of a person so thoroughly broken that they no longer possessed a will of their own. For those who survived this ordeal, the journey was far from over. The signed confession was not a ticket to freedom. It was a one-way ticket to another level of hell, the concentration camp. For women arrested by the Reich, the destination was often a place whose name sounded deceptively beautiful, Ravensbrück. Located in a scenic, wooded area north of Berlin, it was the largest concentration camp established specifically for female prisoners. The Nazis presented it to the world and to the local German population as a re-education and labor camp where social women, prostitutes, criminals, and political dissidents were taught discipline and useful skills. This was a carefully maintained fiction. In reality, Ravensbrück was a center for slave labor and a laboratory for some of the most sadistic medical experiments ever conceived. Upon arrival, the women were subjected to the same dehumanizing rituals as in the Gestapo prisons, but on an industrial scale. They were stripped naked in front of leering guards, their heads shaved, their bodies scrubbed with caustic disinfectants, and they were issued the striped uniform that signified their new status as subhuman. Personal possessions were confiscated, and with them, the last vestiges of individual identity. They became numbers, pieces of camp inventory. The logic of the camp was the logic of slow, managed death. The prisoners were systematically starved on a diet of watery soup, sawdust-laced bread, and ersatz coffee. They were forced into grueling labor, often for munitions companies like Siemens and Halsk, which built factories adjacent to the camp to exploit this endless supply of free, expendable workers. The women toiled for 12 hours a day in unsafe, unheated workshops, their bodies wasting away from malnutrition and exhaustion. The slightest infraction was met with savage punishment. Public floggings, confinement in the punishment bunker, or being forced to stand at attention for hours in the freezing cold of the Appelplatz, the central roll call square. Disease was rampant. Typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis swept through the overcrowded, unhygienic barracks, and the camp infirmary was little more than a place to die. Yet, for a select group of prisoners, an even more terrifying fate awaited them, one that would be carried out in the name of medical science. In the summer of 1942, a new program of experiments began at Ravensbrück, sanctioned by the highest levels of the SS. The purpose was to study the effectiveness of the then-new sulfonamide drugs in treating battlefield wounds. To do this, the camp doctors needed to simulate the conditions of a German soldier wounded at the front. They selected a group of 74 young Polish women, most of whom were political prisoners from the Lublin resistance. These women, who would later be known by the code name Kaninchen, or rabbits, became human guinea pigs. Under the direction of doctors like Karl Gebhardt, Himmler's personal physician, and Fritz Fischer, the women were dragged to the camp operating theater. Without proper anesthesia, the doctors made deep incisions in their legs. Into these open wounds, they deliberately introduced aggressive bacteria like staphylococcus, gas gangrene, and tetanus. To make the infections even more severe and to better mimic a shrapnel wound, they would often shove slivers of wood, rusty nails, dirt, and ground glass deep into the muscle tissue. The agony that followed was indescribable. The women developed raging fevers, their legs swelling to enormous size, turning black and green with gangrene, and oozing foul-smelling pus. They lay in their barracks, screaming in pain, their bodies convulsing with infection. Some were then treated with the experimental sulfa drugs. Others were deliberately left untreated to serve as a control group. The doctors would observe and meticulously document the progression of the disease, noting the rate of tissue necrosis and the onset of sepsis with cold, scientific detachment. The suffering of their subjects was, to them, merely a data point. When a prisoner died from the infection, her body was dissected, her leg bones harvested for further study. The survivors were left with permanently crippled limbs, horrific scars, and profound psychological trauma. One survivor, Jadwiga Zaido, later testified that she witnessed doctors removing large sections of bone from one woman's leg and transplanting them into another, simply to see if it was possible. These were not healing procedures. They were acts of pure, unrestrained medical sadism, cloaked in the thinnest veneer of scientific inquiry. The women of Ravensbrück resisted in the only way they could. They secretly documented their experiences, smuggling out messages written in urine on scraps of paper, ensuring that if they died, the world would one day know what had been done to them. While Ravensbrück became a center for surgical experimentation, another, even more infamous name was transforming the very concept of medical ethics into a grotesque parody at the sprawling death complex of Auschwitz-Birkenau. That name was Dr. Joseph Mengele, a man with 2 doctorates, one in anthropology and one in medicine. Mengele was the epitome of a Nazi scientist. He was handsome, impeccably dressed, often whistling classical music as he went about his work. He could be charming, even kind, offering sweets to the children he had selected for his experiments. This outward polish made his underlying depravity all the more monstrous. Mengele arrived in Auschwitz in May 1943 and quickly became the chief camp physician of Birkenau. He was known as the Angel of Death for his role in the selections on the ramp, where arriving transports of Jews and others were processed. With a flick of his white-gloved hand, he would nonchalantly consign the vast majority to the gas chambers, while selecting a few, the healthy, the strong, and those with unusual physical characteristics, for slave labor or for his own private medical research. Mengele was obsessed with twins. He saw them as the perfect natural experiment, a way to explore the mysteries of heredity and environment, a cornerstone of Nazi racial theory. He believed that by studying twins, he could unlock the secrets to increasing the Aryan birth rate. His research block became a twisted sanctuary within the hell of Auschwitz. The Mengele twins, as they came to be known, received slightly better food and were spared the gas chambers, but only so they could endure his horrific experiments. He would line them up and meticulously measure every part of their bodies, comparing data between siblings with feverish excitement. Then the procedures would begin. He injected diseases and chemicals into one twin to observe the differences in reaction with the healthy, uninjected sibling. He would transfuse the blood of one twin into the other. He performed surgeries without anesthesia, removing organs and limbs. He dripped chemicals into their eyes in an attempt to change their color to the desirable Aryan blue, a process that caused excruciating pain and often blindness. His cruelty knew no bounds, and his scientific curiosity was utterly divorced from any sense of morality. The ultimate goal of his twin studies was comparative pathology. When one twin died, either from a disease he had injected or because he had murdered them directly with an injection of phenol to the heart, he would then immediately kill the other twin with the same method. This allowed him to perform simultaneous autopsies, to harvest their organs and compare them, looking for differences that might be attributable to the experiment he had conducted. The preserved organs and skeletons of his victims were then dispatched to medical institutes back in Germany as research specimens. The twins lived in a state of constant terror, knowing that the special attention they received was merely a prelude to a gruesome death. Eva Moses-Kor, a survivor of Mengele's experiments, recalled the psychological torment of seeing her twin sister, Miriam, fall gravely ill from an injection, knowing that if Miriam died, she would be taken and killed within hours. Mengele's obsession was not limited to twins. He was fascinated by any and all human abnormalities. He collected dwarves, forming a special troupe for his studies, including the Ovitz family, a group of 7 siblings from Romania. He subjected them to a battery of painful and humiliating procedures, from extracting spinal fluid to pulling out healthy teeth and hair. He studied people with heterochromia, or different colored eyes, and those with physical deformities. In each case, his interest was not in healing, but in a ghoulish form of collection and classification. The people before him were not patients. They were not even human. They were specimens, walking exhibits for his theories on racial degeneracy. All of this was done under the banner of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Anthropology, Human Heredity, and Eugenics in Berlin, lending his butchery the institutional authority of one of Germany's most prestigious scientific bodies. His work was not the rogue action of a madman. It was the sanctioned, state-sponsored research of the Third Reich, the logical endpoint of an ideology that defined human worth in purely biological and racial terms. By the autumn and winter of 1944, the engine of this systematic horror began to sputter. The Allied armies were closing in from the west, and the Soviet Red Army was relentlessly advancing from the east. The Reich, which was supposed to last 1,000 years, was collapsing into a bloody Götterdämmerung. For the prisoners languishing in the camps, the sound of distant artillery was a terrifying symphony of hope and dread. Liberation was near, but so was the final, desperate spasm of Nazi cruelty. Himmler issued a directive. No prisoner was to be allowed to fall into enemy hands alive. They were the living evidence of Germany's crimes, and that evidence had to be erased. The gas chambers and crematoria at Auschwitz and other camps began working at a feverish, unprecedented pace. But there were too many prisoners and not enough time. The SS leadership devised a new, final solution to the problem of their captives, the death marches. The plan was to evacuate the camps, marching the inmates on foot deep into the interior of Germany, away from the advancing front lines. It was a strategy born of fanaticism and chaos. On paper, it was a transfer of prisoners. In practice, it was mass murder by other means. In the brutal cold of the Central European winter, hundreds of thousands of prisoners were forced out of their barracks and onto the roads. They were already spectral figures, emaciated skeletons worn down by years of starvation, disease, and abuse. Most had only their thin, striped uniforms and crude wooden clogs to protect them from the biting winds and deep snow. They were given no food, no water, and no rest. The marches stretched for hundreds of kilometers, a staggering, shuffling column of the living dead. The cruelty of the guards, who knew their world was ending, became unhinged. They were no longer the disciplined enforcers of system. They were defeated, vengeful men lashing out at the most helpless of victims. Anyone who stumbled, anyone who fell behind, anyone who could not keep the grueling pace was instantly shot. The crack of a pistol became the constant, rhythmic percussion of the march. Prisoners were shot for trying to scoop up a handful of snow to quench their thirst. They were shot for pausing to help a fallen comrade. They were shot for simply collapsing from sheer, absolute exhaustion. The roads and fields of Poland and Germany became littered with a trail of frozen, contorted corpses, a gruesome path marking the retreat of the Nazi Empire. Primo Levi, an Auschwitz survivor, described the march as a wandering on foot, a migration of a people of shadows. It was a vision of the apocalypse, a world stripped of all reason and compassion, where the only law was survival and the only certainty was death. The local German population could not claim ignorance. These spectral columns of humanity shuffled directly through their towns and villages. Civilians watched from their windows as these skeletal figures, their eyes hollowed out with suffering, were beaten and shot in their streets. Some watched with pity, a few brave souls even attempting to toss out a piece of bread, often earning a threat from a guard for their trouble. Many others, however, watched with indifference or contempt, seeing the prisoners not as fellow human beings, but as the enemies of the state that years of propaganda had taught them to despise. The marches were the Nazi system's final, public act of degradation, a mobile concentration camp that forced the German people to confront the human consequences of their leader's ideology, even as the regime itself crumbled to ash. Of the approximately 715,000 people still in the camp system in January 1945, it is estimated that at least 250,000, and perhaps more, died during these death marches. They perished from starvation, from exposure, from disease, and from the casual brutality of their guards. They died within sight of a freedom they had dreamed of for years. For those who did survive, liberation was a bewildering, surreal experience. When Allied and Soviet soldiers entered the camps, Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Buchenwald, Mauthausen, and the others, they were not prepared for what they found. They were hardened combat veterans who had seen the worst of the battlefield, but nothing could prepare them for this. They found mountains of skeletal corpses piled up like firewood. They found barracks filled with the dying, human beings so emaciated they were no longer recognizable as such. The stench of death, disease, and human waste was overwhelming. General Eisenhower, upon visiting a liberated camp, insisted that every soldier in the area and journalists from back home be brought to witness the scenes so that they can tell the folks at home. He understood that this was a crime so vast, so outside the bounds of normal human experience, that people would simply not believe it unless they were forced to see the evidence with their own eyes. In the immediate aftermath, a strange and difficult chapter began. For the perpetrators, it was a time of reckoning, or more often, of escape. Men like Joseph Mengele, the angel of death, slipped through the cracks. Using a network of sympathizers, he escaped to Argentina, living out the rest of his life in freedom, dying of a stroke while swimming in 1979. He never faced a court of law. He never expressed a single word of remorse for the thousands of lives he destroyed. Others, like Karl Gebhardt, the mastermind of the Ravensbrück experiments, were captured and tried at Nuremberg in the doctor's trial, confronted with the testimony of his surviving victims, the rabbits, who hobbled to the witness stand to show the court their mutilated legs. Gebhardt remained defiant, arguing that his actions were legitimate scientific research in service of the state. He was convicted of war crimes and crimes against humanity and was hanged in 1948. But for every perpetrator brought to justice, countless others melted back into society, becoming quiet, unassuming old men, their monstrous pasts hidden from their neighbors and even their own families. For the survivors, liberation was not an end to suffering, but the beginning of a new, lifelong struggle. They had to learn how to live again in a world that had become alien to them. They carried the physical scars, the tattooed numbers on their arms, the crippled limbs, the chronic illnesses. But the psychological wounds were deeper and more persistent. They wrestled with survivors' guilt, the agonizing, unanswerable question of, why me? Why did I live when so many others died? They struggled with memory, with the need to bear witness and the overwhelming desire to forget. Many found that the world did not want to hear their stories. The details were too ugly, too disturbing. They were encouraged to move on, to look to the future. But the past was not a country they could simply leave. It lived inside them, in their nightmares, in their moments of quiet reflection, in the faces of their children. The silence that had filled the Gestapo cells and the camp barracks had followed them home. The history of this period is not merely a catalog of horrors. It is a profound and enduring warning. It reveals how easily a society can surrender its moral compass to a seductive ideology, how bureaucracy can be used to systematize evil, and how science and medicine, when divorced from ethics, can become instruments of unimaginable cruelty. The Gestapo, the camps, the medical experiments, and the death marches were not aberrations carried out by a few deranged individuals. They were the product of a system that was built, managed, and supported by thousands of ordinary people, civil servants, doctors, lawyers, engineers, and soldiers, who chose to follow orders, who chose to look away, who convinced themselves that their small part in the vast machine was insignificant. The contrast between the propaganda and the reality is perhaps the most chilling lesson of all. The Third Reich projected an image of strength, order, and Aryan perfection. It showed smiling, healthy families, monumental architecture, and disciplined, triumphant armies. But behind this gleaming facade was the squalor and stench of the barracks, the cold terror of the interrogation room, and the agonizing screams of the medical subject. It was a regime built on a foundation of human suffering its power derived directly from its capacity to inflict pain and annihilate life. To remember this history is not an act of morbid fascination. It is a vital act of moral and intellectual self-defense. It is to recognize the warning signs of dehumanizing language, the danger of unchecked state power, and the absolute necessity of defending the principle that every single human life possesses an intrinsic and inviolable worth. The story of what happened in those cells and on those operating tables is a testament to the depths of human depravity. But the stories of the survivors, of those who endured and bore witness, are a testament to the incredible, stubborn, and ultimately indomitable resilience of the human spirit. Their memory is a sacred trust, a final line of defense against the silence that evil craves.